When I told people I was going to marry a Filipina, almost nobody congratulated me. Some smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile you give someone who's just shared good news. It was the kind of smile people wear when they're trying to figure out how to tell you you're making a mistake. One friend leaned across the table and asked, "Are you absolutely sure you know what you're doing?" Another didn't even try to soften it. "She's after something," he said. "You'll see." Family members were more careful with their words, but the message never really changed. They told me to slow down, to think with my head instead of my heart. Some quietly wondered why a woman from the other side of the world would choose someone like me when she had never even lived the same life I had. Others didn't wonder. They had already decided. According to them, they knew exactly how the story would end. I'd lose my savings. She'd disappear. I'd come crawling back embarrassed, pretending none of it had happened. What surprised me wasn't that strangers on the internet believed those things. People online can invent an entire story about your life from a single photograph. What hurt were the people who actually knew me, the ones who had watched me make careful decisions for years, the ones who trusted my judgment until this. For a while, I started wondering if they saw something I didn't. That's the part most people never admit. It's easy to tell the story years later and pretend you never had doubts. I did, more than once. There were nights when I'd end a video call, sit alone in a quiet room, and replay every warning I'd heard. Maybe I was being naive. Maybe everyone else could see the ending while I was still reading the first chapter. There was one conversation in particular, one that almost convinced me to cancel everything before it had the chance to begin. If that conversation had gone differently, there's a good chance none of what I'm about to tell you would have happened. But before I tell you about that, you need to understand how all of this started. Because unlike what many people assumed, this wasn't a whirlwind romance. It wasn't a vacation fling. And it definitely wasn't love at first sight. It began with something much simpler, a conversation neither of us expected to matter. It started with a message I almost ignored. Not because it looked suspicious. Not because it sounded unusual. I simply wasn't looking for anything. At that point in my life, I had settled into a routine that rarely changed. I went to work. I came home, made dinner, watched a little television, read for a while, then did it all again the next morning. There wasn't anything particularly wrong with my life. It was comfortable, predictable, the kind of routine that slowly becomes invisible because you've lived it for so long. One evening I noticed a message waiting for me. It wasn't romantic. There wasn't a compliment. There wasn't a pickup line. Just a simple question about something I'd posted online. I answered. She replied. That could have been the end of it. Instead, the conversation continued the next day, then the day after that. If you'd asked me during those first few weeks what we were becoming, I honestly couldn't have told you. We weren't planning a future. We weren't talking about marriage. Most of the time, we weren't even talking about anything important. We talked about ordinary things, what we'd eaten that day, movies we'd both seen years ago, funny stories from work, music, the weather. Little frustrations that seemed significant in the moment, but would be forgotten by the following week. The more we talked, the more I noticed something I hadn't expected. Hours passed without either of us trying to impress the other. There was no performance, no pretending to be someone we weren't. I never felt like I needed to carefully choose every word. Conversation became easy, and after enough time, easy became familiar. One night, she laughed so hard at something completely ridiculous that she couldn't finish her sentence. I started laughing too. Not because the joke was especially clever, but because her laughter was impossible not to join. After we finally stopped laughing, I realized something. That had been the first time in a very long while I'd completely forgotten I was sitting alone. That surprised me, more than I wanted to admit. As weeks turned into months, those conversations became part of my day. If something interesting happened, I wanted to tell her. If I saw a beautiful sunset, I'd take a picture without even thinking about it. When something went wrong, she was often the first person I wanted to talk to. None of it happened all at once. There wasn't one magical moment when friendship suddenly became love. It happened so gradually, I don't think either of us noticed it while it was happening. And maybe that's why it felt real. Looking back now, I think that's where many people misunderstood our story. They assumed our relationship began with romance. It didn't. It began with trust, and trust takes time. What nobody knew was that the first real test of that trust was coming much sooner than either of us expected. For almost a year, our relationship existed inside phone screens, morning messages, late-night video calls, photos of quiet moments that probably wouldn't have meant much to anyone else. A meal she'd cooked, the rain outside my window, a stray cat that had decided her front porch belonged to him. It sounds ordinary now. Maybe it even sounds a little boring. But ordinary has a way of becoming important when it's shared with the right person. Without realizing it, we had quietly become part of each other's routines. There was one problem. Neither of us had any idea whether the connection we felt through a screen would survive real life. It's one thing to enjoy talking to someone for hours. It's another to sit across from them at breakfast, with no phone between you, no internet connection, and no button to end the conversation if things become awkward. That question stayed in the back of my mind for months. I don't think either of us wanted to say it out loud. What if we'd built this entire relationship on imagination? What if we were filling in the blanks with who we hoped the other person was? The longer we waited, the bigger those questions became. Eventually, one of us had to say it. "So," she smiled, "when are we finally going to meet?" I laughed, mostly because I didn't have an answer. Traveling halfway around the world wasn't something I could decide over the weekend. There were flights, vacation time, savings, planning. And if I was being honest, there was fear. Not fear of her. Fear of discovering we'd both been wrong. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one evening with my laptop open. I looked at airline prices, closed the screen, opened it again the next night, then closed it again. I probably repeated that little routine a dozen times. Buying a ticket felt different from talking about buying one. A ticket meant there was no hiding behind possibilities anymore. It meant one day I'd walk through an airport, look around, and finally see the person I'd spent so many months getting to know. If we smiled and everything felt natural, our lives might change forever. If it didn't, I'd have a very long flight home with plenty of time to wonder what I'd missed. Then something happened that pushed me toward making a decision. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. One afternoon she said, "I hope we meet someday, but if we don't, I'm still grateful we became friends." She wasn't trying to pressure me. She wasn't asking for promises. She wasn't making me feel guilty. She simply accepted that life doesn't always unfold the way people hope. That single sentence stayed with me long after the call ended, because for the first time, I realized she wasn't trying to convince me to come. She was simply happy I was already in her life. And somehow, that made buying the ticket much easier. What I didn't know was that telling the people closest to me would become far more difficult than booking the flight itself. Buying the ticket turned out to be the easy part. Telling everyone else, that was something entirely different. At first, I didn't make a big announcement. I mentioned it the way someone might mention an upcoming vacation. I'll be out of the country for a couple of weeks. Most people simply asked where I was going. The Philippines. That answer usually earned a curious look. Then came the next question. Why? When I explained that I was finally meeting someone I'd gotten to know online, the room always seemed to become just a little quieter. Some people tried to hide their reactions. Others didn't. One friend stared at me for several seconds before saying, "You can't be serious." I laughed because I assumed he was joking. He wasn't. He asked how long we'd known each other, whether we'd ever met in person, whether I'd sent money, if she had asked for expensive gifts, if she had family who expected financial help. The questions kept coming so quickly I barely had time to answer them. When I finally did, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I've heard this story before." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was cruel, but because I realized he believed it. In his mind, he wasn't criticizing me. He thought he was trying to save me. Over the next few weeks, similar conversations happened again and again. Some came from friends, some came from relatives. Even a coworker I'd always respected pulled me aside one afternoon. He didn't tell me not to go. Instead, he shared an article he'd found online. Then another, and another. Every story seemed to end the same way. Someone lost everything. Someone had been deceived. Someone trusted the wrong person. By the time I finished reading, I started asking myself questions I'd never asked before. Was I missing warning signs because I wanted the relationship to work? Had I confused kindness with love? Was everyone seeing something I couldn't? I never told her how much those conversations affected me. Not right away. She hadn't done anything to deserve that weight. Every time we talked, she was exactly the same person she'd always been. She never rushed me, never asked when I was sending money, never hinted that I owed her anything. If anything, she seemed more interested in hearing about my day than talking about herself. That made the doubts even more confusing. How could the woman I spoke with every evening be so different from the person everyone else was convinced she had to be? Eventually, I decided there was only one way to find out. I stopped asking everyone else what they thought, and I started paying closer attention to what she actually did. That's when I noticed something I probably should have seen much sooner. Whenever we talked about the future, she never talked about leaving her country. She talked about building a life together. There was a difference. At the time, I couldn't fully explain why that mattered. Later, I realized it mattered more than almost anything else. The problem was, I still hadn't told her about the conversation that nearly made me cancel the entire trip. And once I finally did, I was certain she'd never want to speak to me again. For several days, I almost didn't say anything. Every time we talked, I told myself I'd bring it up. Then we'd start laughing about something, or she'd ask how work was going. And I couldn't bring myself to ruin the moment. Eventually, I realized keeping it to myself wasn't fair. If we were serious about meeting, she deserved to know what was going through my mind. One evening, after we'd been talking for nearly an hour, I finally took a deep breath. "There's something I need to tell you." She smiled. "Okay." I told her about the conversations, the warnings, the articles people kept sending me, the stories I'd been reading online. I admitted that some of them had scared me, more than I wanted to admit. The longer I talked, the quieter I became, not because I expected her to argue, because I realized how terrible it sounded. Here I was, telling someone I cared about, that people believe she couldn't be trusted simply because of where she was born. When I finished, there was silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, just enough time for her to think. Then she asked one question. "Do you believe them?" I didn't answer right away, because I wasn't completely sure how to. "I don't think I do," I said, "but I'd be lying if I said none of it got into my head." She nodded. Not angrily, not defensively, just nodded. "I understand." Those two words surprised me more than anything else she could have said. She didn't accuse me of doubting her. She didn't tell me I was wrong. She didn't demand that I prove my trust. Instead, she said something I'll never forget. "If someone told me the same stories," she said, "I would probably have questions too." I just sat there looking at the screen. I hadn't expected empathy. I certainly hadn't expected honesty. Then she smiled. A small smile, the kind that quietly puts people at ease. "You don't have to trust what strangers say, but you also don't have to ignore them. Just don't decide who I am before you've had the chance to know me." That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. She wasn't asking me to choose between her and everyone else. She wasn't asking me to ignore common sense. She was simply asking to be judged by her own actions. Looking back, that was probably the most reasonable thing anyone had said during the entire situation. That conversation changed something inside me. Not because all my doubts disappeared. They didn't. Trust doesn't suddenly become complete because of one meaningful conversation. But fear stopped making every decision. Instead of asking, "What if everyone is right?" I started asking, "What if they're wrong?" A few days later, I finally clicked the button I'd been avoiding for months. I bought the ticket. I had no idea that the hardest part of the journey still wasn't the flight. It was stepping through the airport doors and wondering whether the woman walking toward me would feel as familiar in person as she already did in my heart. No matter how many times I'd imagined that day, none of those versions matched reality. After all those months of talking, all the photographs, all the video calls, I still felt nervous walking through the airport. I remember checking my phone more times than I needed to, looking at the arrival information, looking around, then looking back at the screen again, mostly because it gave me something to do with my hands. I'd spent so much time wondering what would happen if we met and there was no connection. What if conversation suddenly felt forced? What if we smiled politely, hugged, and immediately realized we'd made a terrible mistake? Those thoughts followed me right up until the moment I walked through the last set of doors. Then I saw her. She smiled. I smiled. For a second, neither of us moved. Then we both laughed. Not because anything was funny, because all that nervous energy we'd been carrying for months finally had somewhere to go. The first thing she said wasn't romantic. She looked at me and said, "You look more tired than you do on video." I laughed again. "I've been traveling for what feels like forever." She nodded. "I know." Then she reached over, took one of my bags, and started walking. That's how we met. No dramatic music, no movie scene. Just two people who were relieved the other one was exactly who they'd hoped for. What surprised me most wasn't that she looked like the person I'd been talking to. It was that she felt familiar. Within an hour, it almost seemed strange that we'd never met before. Conversation didn't have to be restarted. There wasn't an awkward period of getting to know one another. We simply continued talking, only this time we were walking beside each other instead of staring at a screen. During those first few days, I paid attention to everything. Not because I was trying to catch her doing something wrong, because I'd promised myself I would be honest about what I saw. I noticed how she treated people working in restaurants, how she spoke to drivers, how she greeted older relatives, how patient she was when plans changed unexpectedly. None of those moments were impressive on their own. Together, they told me far more about her character than anything anyone had warned me about. One afternoon, we stopped at a small roadside cafe. Nothing fancy. Plastic chairs. A few electric fans trying their best against the afternoon heat. While we waited for our food, an elderly woman walked slowly past our table, carrying several heavy bags. Before I even realized what was happening, she stood up. She walked over, smiled, picked up 2 of the bags, and helped the woman carry them across the road. No one applauded. No one took out a phone to record it. She came back a couple of minutes later, sat down, and started talking about something completely unrelated, as though she'd done nothing unusual. She never mentioned it again, neither did I. But I remembered, because moments like that can't be rehearsed. They happen when someone forgets they're being watched. And somewhere during that first week, without even realizing it, I stopped comparing the woman in front of me to the stories other people had told. I was finally seeing her, for myself. The only thing I wasn't prepared for was how difficult it would be to say goodbye when it was time for me to leave. People often ask me what the hardest part of that first trip was. Most assume it had something to do with adjusting to a different country, different food, different customs, different weather. Honestly, none of those things were difficult. The hardest part was leaving. The morning I flew home felt completely different from the morning I had arrived. A week earlier, everything had been uncertain. Now, certainty made saying goodbye even harder. Neither of us tried to pretend it wasn't emotional. We kept telling each other, "We'll see each other again," and we believed it. But belief doesn't make airports any easier. After checking my bags, there came that awkward moment where neither of us knew exactly what to say. So we stood there for a while, talking about ordinary things, the flight, the weather, whether I'd remembered to pack everything. Anything except the fact that one of us was about to walk away. Eventually, they called my flight. I hugged her, picked up my backpack, started walking toward security. Then I looked back. She was still standing exactly where I'd left her, smiling, waving, waiting until I disappeared from sight. That image stayed with me for the entire trip home. Back in America, something felt different. The apartment hadn't changed, my routine hadn't changed, even the coffee tasted the same. But I had. The silence that used to feel peaceful now felt unusually loud. I'd gotten used to hearing her voice every day in person. Now I was counting the hours until we could call again. That's when I realized something that caught me completely off guard. I wasn't missing the excitement of traveling. I was missing ordinary life with her. Cooking dinner together, walking through a market, stopping for coffee, laughing over things that wouldn't even make sense to anyone else. Those were the moments I kept replaying, not the big ones, the small ones. Friends noticed the change almost immediately. "So," one of them asked with a grin, "reality matched the fantasy?" I smiled. It actually felt normal. He frowned. "Normal?" "Yeah. I think that's what surprised me the most. There wasn't some dramatic moment where fireworks went off. It just felt like we'd known each other much longer than we actually had." He looked unconvinced. Then came the question I'd started expecting. "So, when's she moving here?" I paused, because for the first time, I wasn't sure that was the future I wanted. Before meeting her, I'd assumed that if our relationship worked, the next step would naturally be bringing her to America. It seemed obvious. At least it did on paper. But after spending time together, I realized something I hadn't expected. Whenever we talked about the future, she never described escaping her life. She described sharing it. There was a quiet confidence in the way she talked about home, about family, about community. She wasn't asking me to rescue her. She wasn't asking to be rescued at all. And the more I thought about that, the more one uncomfortable question kept returning. What if, instead of asking her to leave everything she'd ever known, I was the one who needed to reconsider everything I thought the future looked like? That single question would eventually change the direction of my entire life.
That question stayed with me for months. What if I was asking the wrong person to make the bigger sacrifice? It wasn't a question I could answer overnight. Life has a way of making big decisions seem simple until you start listing everything you'd have to leave behind. My job, my apartment, friends, family, the routines I'd spent years building without even realizing it. Those weren't small things, they were an entire life. Whenever people asked how the relationship was going, I noticed something. Almost everyone assumed the goal was the same. So, when is she coming to America? I stopped correcting people after a while. Mostly because I didn't have an answer anymore. Instead, I found myself asking different questions. Would she really be happier leaving everything familiar behind? Would I? The more we talked about the future, the more obvious something became. Neither of us wanted the other person to give up everything alone. We wanted to build something together. The challenge was figuring out where. During one of my visits, we were sitting outside after dinner. The neighborhood had started to quiet down. Children who had been playing in the street were heading home. Someone nearby was listening to music. Dogs barked in the distance. It wasn't a remarkable evening. It was just life. She looked over at me and asked, "Are you happy here?" It sounded like such a simple question, but I couldn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't know, because I was afraid of what the answer meant. Finally, I smiled. "Yeah, I think I am." She nodded and looked back down the street. Neither of us said anything else for a while. We didn't need to. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in silence. Later that night, lying awake, I realized something. For years, I'd measured success by how busy I was, how much I earned, how many hours I worked, how much I could save. There was nothing wrong with those goals. They'd helped me build a stable life. But somewhere along the way, I'd quietly accepted the idea that happiness would always come later. After the next promotion, after the next raise, after retirement. There was always another milestone waiting. Standing there, thousands of miles from the life I'd built, I began wondering if I'd been postponing the part that mattered most. That didn't mean moving was suddenly easy. Far from it. There were spreadsheets, budgets, long conversations, sleepless nights. I thought about healthcare, money, what my family would think, whether I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Some evenings, I convinced myself it was impossible. Other evenings, I wondered why I was still trying to convince myself to stay where I was. Eventually, there comes a point where every decision stops being about certainty and starts becoming about courage. Mine came the morning I handed in my notice at work. As I walked back to my car, I remember sitting behind the steering wheel for several minutes. No music, no phone, just silence. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't panicking. I simply realized there was no turning back now. The next chapter of my life had already begun. I just hadn't boarded the plane yet. People sometimes imagine that moving to another country feels like the beginning of a permanent vacation. About 6 months after I moved, something happened that made me quietly wonder if everyone had been right after all. I'll come back to that in a minute. Because first,
You need to understand what life actually looked like once the excitement wore off. The truth is much less glamorous. The first few weeks were filled with paperwork, finding a place to live, learning where to buy groceries, trying to remember which stores carried the things I was used to, figuring out transportation, opening bank accounts, understanding new routines. None of it was exciting. But somehow, doing those ordinary things together made the place begin to feel like home. Of course, not everything was easy. There were days when I became frustrated over the smallest things. I'd stand in a store looking for something simple, only to discover it wasn't available. I'd misread a situation because I was still learning the local culture. Sometimes plans changed at the last minute. Sometimes appointments took longer than I expected. At first, those moments bothered me. I liked schedules, predictability, knowing exactly how my day would unfold. Life had taught me that being organized solved most problems. Here, I was slowly learning that flexibility solved just as many. One afternoon, I found myself getting irritated over something so minor that I can't even remember what it was. Maybe we had to wait longer than expected. Maybe traffic had slowed us down. Whatever it was, I could feel my patience disappearing. She looked over at me, smiled, and quietly said, "We'll get there." Not, "Calm down." Not, "You're overreacting." Just, "We'll get there." Something about the way she said it made me laugh. Because she was right. An extra 20 minutes wasn't changing my life. I was carrying years of habits into a place that didn't always move at the same pace. Little by little, I stopped fighting that reality. And strangely enough, life became a lot less stressful. That doesn't mean we never disagreed. We did. Every couple does. Sometimes we misunderstood each other. Sometimes we were both stubborn. Sometimes we'd spend an hour trying to explain something that should have taken 5 minutes. There was even one evening when I climbed into bed, wondering whether we'd made a mistake trying to build a life together. Not because we had stopped loving each other, because both of us were exhausted. The next morning, after some coffee and a calm conversation, the problem suddenly felt much smaller than it had the night before. That was another lesson relationships taught me. Not every difficult day is a sign you're on the wrong path. Sometimes it's just a difficult day. But one thing always stood out to me. It was never about winning. Whenever one of us was upset, the goal wasn't proving who was right. The goal was understanding why the other person felt the way they did. These days, I think that's one of the healthiest habits we ever developed. Months passed. The routines that once felt unfamiliar became ordinary. I had favorite restaurants, favorite walking routes, neighbors who greeted me by name, shop owners who recognized me. Without realizing it, I had quietly stopped thinking of myself as someone who was visiting. I was building a life. And one evening, while sitting outside watching the sun disappear, it suddenly hit me. I hadn't thought about what other people had warned me about in a very long time. Not because I'd forgotten, because real life had answered those questions for me. The opinions that had once seemed so loud had slowly been replaced by everyday experience. And everyday experience is a difficult thing to argue with. What I still didn't know was that our biggest challenge wasn't going to come from strangers. It was going to come from life itself. Life has a way of testing every relationship. Not all at once, little by little. A stressful week, an unexpected expense, a misunderstanding that starts over something small and somehow grows much bigger than it should. Ours was no different. For a while, I think we were both trying so hard to make everything perfect that neither of us admitted when something wasn't. I remember one evening sitting quietly after dinner. Neither of us was angry, neither of us was yelling, but something felt off. Finally, I asked, "Is everything okay?" She hesitated before answering. "I think you're still trying to solve every problem by yourself." At first, I didn't understand what she meant. She smiled gently. "You don't have to carry everything alone." Those words stayed with me, because she was right. Back home, I'd always believed being dependable meant handling every problem myself. If something broke, I fixed it. If money became tight, I worked more. If something worried me, I kept it to myself until I found a solution. I'd spent years believing that was strength. But relationships don't work that way. Sometimes, trying to protect the person you love by hiding your worries only makes them feel shut out. That conversation changed how we talked to each other. Instead of pretending everything was fine, we started being honest much sooner. If one of us felt overwhelmed, we said so. If one of us made a mistake, we admitted it. It wasn't always comfortable, but it built something much stronger than pretending. I don't think trust grows because couples never struggle. I think it grows because they learn they can struggle without walking away. Around that time, another friend from America called. We hadn't spoken in several months. After catching up, he finally asked the question I'd heard dozens of times. "So, was everyone wrong?" I smiled. For a second, I wasn't sure how to answer, because the truth wasn't as simple as yes or no. "No," I finally said. "They weren't wrong for wanting to protect me. They just didn't know her." There was silence on the other end of the phone. Then he laughed softly. "So, you really are happy?" I looked across the room. She was reading quietly on the couch, completely unaware of the conversation. I smiled. "Yeah, I really am." That answer came easier than I'd expected, not because every day was perfect, because I had finally stopped expecting perfection. Real happiness isn't built from perfect days. It's built from ordinary ones that you're grateful to share with someone else. And that's something I don't think I truly understood until I built a life here. Several years later, one of the friends who had warned me the most finally came to visit. After a week together, he smiled and quietly admitted, "I understand now." He wasn't apologizing. He was simply acknowledging that real life looked very different than the stories he'd imagined. That meant more to me than hearing, "I was wrong." Every now and then, someone still asks me if moving here was the right decision. Usually it happens after they've heard my story. Sometimes it's someone who's curious. Sometimes it's someone who's nervous about making a big change in their own life. And almost every time, they expect a simple answer. The truth is, no major life decision comes without sacrifice. I left behind people I love, places filled with memories, a career I'd worked hard to build. There are days when I miss familiar things, certain foods, old friends, family gatherings. There are moments when I wish visiting home were as easy as getting in the car. Missing those things doesn't mean I made the wrong decision. It simply means that every meaningful choice costs you something. People sometimes ask if I ever think about what would have happened if I'd listened to everyone. I do, probably more often than they realize. If I'd let fear make the decision, my life would have looked very different. Maybe it would have been easier. Maybe it would have been more familiar. But I also know there would always have been one question I couldn't escape. What if they were wrong? I don't have to wonder anymore, because I found the answer myself. Not through opinions, not through headlines, not through comments from people who had never met either of us. Through living. The biggest lesson I learned had nothing to do with moving overseas. And it had nothing to do with marrying someone from another country. It was much simpler than that. People can only judge a relationship from the outside. The two people living it are the only ones who truly know what happens inside it. That doesn't mean ignoring advice. Sometimes advice can protect us. Sometimes it can save us from real mistakes. But advice should encourage us to ask better questions. It should never decide our future before we've had the chance to discover it ourselves. When people warned me, they believed they were protecting me. I understand that now better than I did back then. If someone they cared about was making a life-changing decision, I'd probably worry too. The difference is, today I'd tell them something different. I'd tell them to pay attention. Take your time. Ask difficult questions. Watch how someone treats other people. Notice how they handle disappointment. See who they are when nobody is watching. And once you've done all of that, make your own decision. Not mine, not your family's, not the internet's, yours. Looking across the room today, I don't see the woman everyone warned me about. I see the woman who laughed with me when life was easy, stood beside me when it wasn't, and helped me build a life that feels more like home than I ever expected. She's still the same person I met all those years ago. The only thing that's really changed is that now everyone else has had the chance to know her too. So, did everyone tell me I'd regret marrying a Filipina? Yes, many of them did. Were they wrong? Not because life became perfect, not because we never struggled. They were wrong because they judged a person before they ever gave her the chance to show them who she really was. And if there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that the best decisions of your life are rarely the ones other people can make for you.